It is almost unbelievable how much Warner Bros. Has impacted the entertainment industry. It's overwhelming. I mean, for almost a century now, they've been one of the largest media companies. Just as a sample, I could list Batman, AOL, Six Flags, Bugs Bunny, HBO, Time Magazine, CNN, Harry Potter, Atari, all things that have heavily involved Warner and all things that will be talked about in this video, in addition to many others. Now, instead of trying to rush through and detail their entire history, I've instead chosen to focus on the more pivotal eras for Warner, specifically 3 separate times where they had fallen and were practically struggling to survive and how they were able to recover from them. Back in the early days of video cameras and movies in the early 1900s, Sam Warner was working as a projectionist at an amusement park in Ohio. The job exposed him to the industry and helped him see the potential of it, so he was able to convince his 2 brothers, Harry and Albert, to put together their savings and invest that $1,000 into buying their own projector. They then established their own business when they took that projector on the road to exhibit films in various buildings all around the state of Ohio and the neighboring state of Pennsylvania. By 1903, they had stopped traveling when they stayed in Pennsylvania to open a stationary Nickelodeon theater, and as the name implies, this truly was a family business. It was here that they were joined by their 4th brother, Jack, who at only 11 years old would go up and sing for the crowd during intermissions. Almost a decade later, they produced their first film called Peril on the Plains, and by 1915, Sam and Jack had moved to Hollywood to produce their films in the warm and sunny weather, while Harry and Albert had moved to the business hub of New York to run their headquarters. They were successfully making and showing movies, but I do need to emphasize that this was still on a comparatively small scale. Making a movie requires a fair amount of money up front, so through most of the 1920s, their survival was always dependent on the success of their next few movies. Luckily, they did have one big star under contract that would reliably attract an audience when they needed it. His name was Rin Tin Tin, and he was a German Shepherd. Believe it or not, in the 1920s, he starred in a bunch of successful movies and was just about the biggest thing that Warner Bros. Had going for them. Over this time, they did grow from a $1,000 projector into making million-dollar movies, but by 1927, they had become too inconsistent, they were thought to be on the verge of bankruptcy, and they had become far too reliant on their biggest star, which again was a dog. But in October of that year, everything turned around for Warner when they helped revolutionize the entire industry with the introduction of a single movie called The Jazz Singer. It's easily one of the most significant movies ever made because it's considered to be the first ever feature-length talking picture. Without getting technical, the Vitaphone was a piece of technology that would synchronize the audio of a record to the visual of the projection. Much like with that initial projector more than 20 years earlier, Sam Warner was the one to see the potential for it and convince the rest of his family to buy the rights to the technology from the company that had developed it. Now, Warner had already used it for a film called Don Juan about a year earlier to sync the music and sound effects, but no actual talking. Since that one received such a positive response from the audiences, they were convinced that they needed to put everything on the line and go really big with their next movie that utilized it. Jack Warner was able to convince popular musician Al Jolson to star in it by offering him a portion of the profits. Harry Warner personally contributed to the film's more than $400,000 budget, and the end result was The Jazz Singer. In the first line of the film, he says, "You ain't heard nothing yet," which was actually really fitting because it completely changed the industry by pretty much killing silent films. The audience loved it, it received an honorary Academy Award, and maybe most importantly for Warner, it proved to be a huge financial success, returning over 5 times their investment. They then used that money to buy a significant production company in addition to another significant chain of movie theaters. Over the next couple of decades, they went on to contract some of the biggest names in Hollywood like Errol Flynn, Bette Davis, Humphrey Bogart, and used them to create some of the biggest, most successful movies of all time, like Casablanca. That's obviously a simplified version of it, but the fact is that through the 1930s and 40s, Warner was easily one of the most successful film studios, and it all started with The Jazz Singer. Though there is some extremely bad luck attached to this. It almost sounds unreal, but in October of 1927, when they had their big New York City premiere and introduced the world to talking pictures, none of the 4 Warner brothers were in attendance. And the reason for that is because Sam Warner had died of a brain hemorrhage at age 40 only 1 day before, and the other 3 were across the country at his funeral. So they all missed the premiere, and even though he was maybe most responsible for it, Sam never got to see what what Warner Bros. Became. Alright, moving on to the next fall, we could say that this one started in the late 1940s and I guess continued for the next 20 years. This one was a pretty big combination of reasons. In 1948, there was a Supreme Court ruling intended to break up and prevent monopolies in the film industry. Up until that point, the major studios, like Warner Bros., would produce the movie, distribute the movie, and show it in their theaters, maintaining control from beginning to end in a vertical monopoly type situation. Well, it was that ruling that put an end to it and essentially forced them to get rid of all their movie theaters, and of course, now they were forced to work with theaters owned by other people, which, for multiple reasons, is less profitable. And then, making things worse, television was becoming popular, so more and more people were choosing to stay home and watch that instead of going out to see movies. And then, with the lower sales, they were no longer able to maintain the contracts for their talent, so they were forced to let them go. All pretty common in the industry at the time, but Warner was bigger and more affected, and unique to them, the Warner family was breaking apart. In 1956, some complex deals happened that separated Harry and Albert from the business, and then Harry died 2 years later. For all of those reasons, it's pretty clear that things were coming apart over at Warner Bros., and I should let you know that from this point, the rest of the video is going to be heavily focused on various mergers and acquisitions because this is where things started to get crazy. In 1967, Jack Warner sold it to Seven Arts, who only owned it for 2 years before selling it to this other company called Kinney National, led by Steve Ross, who I think we can say is responsible for their next rise. See, before this, Kinney was all over the place. They owned a bunch of different unrelated companies, including an office cleaning business and a maker of wood flooring. But more notably, in 1966, they bought a major talent agency called Ashley Famous, getting them involved in entertainment, and the next year they bought the company that would later become known as DC Comics. When they bought the struggling Warner Bros. 2 years later, they made that their central focus. They spun off everything that was unrelated and renamed the company Warner Communications, so now with enough resources focused on the brand, they were able to rebuild it through the 1970s, mostly through a line of successful movies, such as The Exorcist in 1973, that has of course since become a classic. Owning the DC characters allowed them to make Superman in 1978 and the Batman movie, starting with the Michael Keaton one in 1989, that turned out to be their biggest box office success to that point. They also made a lot of Clint Eastwood movies, including the Dirty Harry series, starting in 1971. It was also during this time when they started doing a lot of other things outside of movies. In 1976, they bought Atari, which went really well at first, but then kinda went bad with the video game crash, so they sold the consumer products division of it in 1983. Also, the Looney Tunes. They were big during Warner's first period of popularity, and by the 1980s, they were having somewhat of a resurgence, I guess, with the rest of the Warner company. The demand for their merchandise, along with the DC characters, led to the creation of Warner Bros. Studio Store in 1991, which lasted throughout the rest of that decade. And the licensing of those characters led to Warner acquiring all of Six Flags in 1993, which again was sold a few years later. So we can definitely say that the success of their movies and their characters allowed them to pursue some unexpected things around that time. But the biggest part of their rise here would have to be their 1989 merger with Time. Well, technically, Time bought Warner for $14 billion, and the two came together to form Time Warner. Considering Time already owned a bunch of media assets like Time Magazine and HBO, it was really a big deal when the two came together. And as if that wasn't enough, they went on to buy Turner Broadcasting System in a $7.5 billion stock deal. Right there, they added all of these TV channels to the company, including CNN, Cartoon Network, TBS, and TNT. And as if that wasn't enough, Time Warner was then involved in the largest merger ever in American history, which is also commonly considered to be the worst ever merger in American history. As I'm sure you can guess, that would be the cause of their next fall. See, by the year 2000, AOL had become one of the biggest internet companies out there, valued at around $200 billion on the stock market, which was actually more valuable than Time Warner, so that year they were able to use that strong stock price to acquire Time Warner in a $182 billion stock deal. The two companies came together, but the initial AOL company would own the majority of it. It was revolutionary and exciting. It gave Time Warner a very quick and aggressive involvement in the internet, but the biggest issue with all of it was that AOL was not worth $200 billion. This merger happened right around the peak of the dot-com bubble, when everyone was getting caught up in the hype of investing in internet companies based on very little actual data, so the stock value of many of them, including AOL was way overinflated. Almost immediately after the bubble burst, the public no longer believed that AOL was nearly as valuable, and there were other internal issues as well. The following year, they reported a $99 billion loss, partially resulting from a $46 billion goodwill impairment. They were forced to sell divisions of the company to bring down their $26 billion in debt, and just the way everything went so bad so fast meant that anything could have happened with them. Luckily, they were able to restabilize, partially by distancing themselves from AOL. In 2003, they stopped using it in the name of the company, and in 2009, they became uninvolved completely when they spun it off into its own company. That company, by the way, was acquired by Verizon 6 years later for a much lower amount. And the recovery was also helped by some successful movie series released over that time, including Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and The Matrix. Somewhat recently, in 2018, they were acquired again, this time by AT&T for $85 billion and renamed Warner Media. And I do have to say that it's pretty cool how the Warner name has been so strong through all of these acquisitions and renamings that everyone has always included Warner in the name. Though this time, they did switch up the logo quite a bit, and I cannot say I'm a fan of that. They have since introduced the streaming platform HBO Max, and Warner has been releasing their movies on there. Then, finally, in May of 2021, a new deal was announced where Warner Media is set to be separated into its own new company that'll be 71% owned by AT&T shareholders and 29% owned by Discovery. Having Discovery involved now creates all of these new possibilities for streaming and everything else, so it'll be exciting to see what happens with this. But until then, let me know in the comments, what do you think of these rises and falls, and what do you think of Warner in general? I do want to mention that if you want to hear more about some of these subjects, I have made videos that talk about them in more depth, and there's just so much involved here, so any thoughts you have about any of the stuff that I talked about, leave them in the comments.